John Miller's mornings always began before the sun rose over New York City. By 05:30, while most of the city was still wrapped in sleep, he was already on the subway heading toward the towering glass building where he worked. His uniform was simple: a navy shirt with his name stitched on the pocket, a pair of sturdy work pants, and shoes worn thin from years of walking endless corridors. He carried a small lunchbox that Emily had decorated with stickers, the bright shapes of hearts and stars, making it stand out against the grayness of his routine. For John, the day always started the same way: emptying trash bins, wiping down desks, fixing what was broken. He moved quietly, almost like a shadow. People passed him in the hall without looking. Sometimes they left coffee cups still half full on desks or dropped papers on the floor as if they expected him to clean up after them. They rarely said thank you. To them, he was part of the background, a fixture of the building, not a person with a life, a daughter, or dreams of his own. Yet John worked with steady patience, never cutting corners, never complaining. He believed that dignity came from doing even the smallest tasks well. His life outside those walls was just as modest. Emily was 8 years old, full of energy, with wide brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. She loved drawing pictures for him, taping them to the refrigerator door until the surface was covered in a patchwork of crayon colors. At night, after long shifts, John would sit with her at their small kitchen table, helping with homework or listening to her talk about her day at school. Their apartment was nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms with squeaky floors, but it was filled with warmth. Every evening he reminded himself that every hour of mopping and scrubbing was worth it if it meant Emily grew up safe, fed, and loved. She was his reason for everything. Across the city, in the same skyscraper where John worked, but on the very top floor, another day was beginning for Victoria Hayes. At 07:00 sharp, she stepped out of a sleek black car and into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble. Her presence alone made people step aside. Victoria was 42, tall, striking, always perfectly dressed in tailored suits and dresses from Milan or Paris. Her hair was styled flawlessly, her makeup subtle yet commanding. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted, eyes followed, and silence often filled the space before she spoke. She was the CEO, the woman who had turned a struggling company into a powerhouse. To investors and board members, she was brilliant and untouchable. To employees, she was a figure of authority, respected but distant. Her reputation was that of a woman who never forgot a number, never forgave a mistake, and never showed weakness. But behind the polished exterior, Victoria lived a life few truly saw. Years ago, betrayal had carved trust out of her heart. A marriage that collapsed under the weight of lies left her wary of intimacy. Success came at the cost of companionship. She often returned to her penthouse apartment late at night, greeted only by silence and the city lights stretching far below. People admired her power, but none stayed long enough to know her loneliness. She had built walls so high that even she sometimes wondered if anyone would ever climb them. John and Victoria lived in the same world, but on opposite ends of it. He pushed his cart past boardrooms she commanded. He rode the service elevator while she stepped into the executive lift. He scrubbed away stains left behind by late-night meetings she led. Their lives were parallel lines, never meant to meet. Yet the same building that made John invisible made Victoria untouchable. And it was inside those walls that fate was preparing a collision neither of them expected. What began with a simple act of cruelty would soon bring their worlds together in a way that would change them both forever. It started late on a Friday afternoon, the kind of restless hour when the office buzzed with gossip instead of work. A group of junior executives gathered near the break room, leaning against the polished counters with smirks on their faces. They had noticed John Miller earlier that day, quietly pushing his cart down the hall with his mop and bucket, as invisible as ever. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, suggested that they should give the janitor a night he would never forget. The idea wasn't born from kindness. It was born from cruelty, from the smug amusement of people who thought humiliating someone less fortunate was entertainment. They whispered and laughed as they hatched the plan. The setup was simple. They would sign John up for a blind date at an upscale restaurant downtown, one known for its candlelit tables, elegant atmosphere, and menus without prices. They picked the kind of place where the cheapest glass of wine cost more than John probably made in a day. They told him that someone had expressed interest in meeting him, someone who admired his hard work. They dangled the story with practiced ease, pretending it was a favor, pretending they were doing him a kindness. Behind their grins, they were already picturing him fumbling with silverware, stammering over words, and sweating through a night he could never afford. They planned to sit a few tables away, hidden behind menus and glasses of wine, ready to watch the show unfold. As the afternoon wore on, the joke grew legs. One woman in the group pulled up the restaurant's website, scrolling through pictures of crystal chandeliers and velvet chairs, laughing at the idea of John stepping into that world. Another mimicked his quiet voice, making the others roar with laughter. They called him background furniture, said he probably didn't even own a real suit. Every jab made them laugh harder, and the cruelty of their game became the glue of their camaraderie. John, meanwhile, heard the invitation and hesitated. He had not been on a date in years, not since before Emily was born. Life had been consumed by work and fatherhood, and the idea of someone wanting to meet him felt almost impossible. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but the way they insisted made him wonder if, just maybe, someone really had seen something in him. That hope was fragile but powerful enough to push away his doubts. He agreed to go. That evening, long after the office emptied, John stood in front of a cracked mirror in his small apartment. Emily sat on the bed, swinging her legs, watching her father with wide eyes. He wore his only suit, one he had saved for funerals and weddings. The fabric was old, the cut outdated, but he had polished the shoes until they shined and pressed the jacket as best as he could. He adjusted his tie, his hands trembling, and asked Emily if he looked all right. She nodded with a smile that only children can give, the kind that makes any man stand taller. For the first time in years, John felt like maybe he wasn't invisible. Maybe tonight he could step out of the shadows, if only for a few hours. At 07:15, he walked into the restaurant. The chandeliers glowed above him, the air thick with the sound of clinking glasses and low voices. He hesitated, taking in the luxury that surrounded him, while just a few tables away the pranksters leaned back in their seats, grinning as they waited for the show to begin. John paused at the entrance of the restaurant, the heavy wooden doors closing softly behind him. The chandeliers overhead spilled light across tables covered in crisp white linen, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. He tugged at his tie, trying to steady the knot that felt too tight against his neck. His suit jacket was a little loose in the shoulders, the fabric worn smooth from years in the back of his closet, but he had polished his shoes until they shone. He told himself to walk confidently, though every step felt out of place in the sea of elegance. At a corner table sat a group of employees, the very ones who had lured him here. They leaned toward each other, snickering behind their menus, eyes tracking his every move. John's cheeks burned as he searched for the woman he was supposed to meet. His pulse quickened, his palms damp, every nerve bracing for the laughter that would surely come once this cruel joke revealed itself. Then he saw her. Sitting at a small table by the window was Victoria Hayes. Her presence was undeniable, even in a crowded room. She wore a deep blue dress, her posture straight, her expression composed, yet approachable. For a moment, John thought he must be mistaken. The CEO of his company, the woman who commanded boardrooms and headlines, was the person waiting for him. His heart stumbled in his chest. Victoria looked up and her eyes softened. She smiled warmly, not the professional smile she reserved for investors or staff, but one that carried genuine warmth. She greeted him as if she had been waiting all evening just for him. The knot in John's chest loosened slightly. He pulled out the chair, his hand trembling as he lowered himself into it. He was still bracing for the joke to explode, but instead, Victoria leaned in and asked about his day as though it truly mattered. John stumbled through his words at first, apologizing for not being polished or experienced in places like this. He fidgeted with the edge of his napkin, his voice quiet, but Victoria listened intently, encouraging him with nods, making space for him to speak. Slowly, he began to share more than he had planned. He told her about his childhood dream of becoming a teacher, how he loved books and the idea of helping others learn. He spoke of the day his father died suddenly, leaving him with the responsibility of caring for his mother and younger siblings. College slipped away, replaced by long shifts at whatever jobs he could find. He explained how years of sacrifice had hardened into routine, how he never complained because he believed dignity was in doing the work in front of him with integrity, no matter how small. Victoria's expression shifted as she listened. She had expected awkward small talk, maybe silence, but instead she heard the story of a man who had carried more weight than most, and had done so without bitterness. She was struck by the humility in his tone, the quiet strength in his words. Across the room, the pranksters leaned back in their seats, their smirks fading. They had expected John to stumble, to humiliate himself. Instead, they were watching something else unfold, something they had not planned for. John's vulnerability was not weakness. It was power, the kind that made their shallow laughter seem empty. As the conversation stretched on, John's nerves began to ease. He found himself speaking more freely, forgetting for a moment the weight of eyes watching him. Victoria's attentive gaze gave him permission to be seen. What he didn't realize was that he was not only changing the mood at the table, but also stirring something in her, something she had locked away for years. She began to see him not as a janitor, not as someone beneath her, but as a man whose resilience and dignity commanded respect. By the time he lifted his glass of water and took a steady sip, his hands no longer shook. For the first time in a long while, John felt visible. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table, her eyes fixed on John with a softness that surprised even her. She asked about his life beyond the walls of the office. At first he hesitated, unused to anyone wanting to know more than whether a light bulb had been changed or a leak fixed. But her tone was patient, encouraging. She wanted to hear about him, not just the work he did. He cleared his throat and began carefully. He spoke about Emily, his 8-year-old daughter, how she filled their small apartment with drawings taped to the refrigerator and questions that kept him on his toes. He told her that Emily was the reason he kept going, the reason he woke at 05:30 every morning and came home long after dark. His voice warmed as he described her smile, the way her laughter carried through the halls of their building, brighter than any light he had ever replaced. Victoria listened, nodding, her eyes never leaving his face. She asked what his dreams had been before responsibility came crashing down so young. He admitted he had wanted to be a teacher, that he loved the idea of shaping lives through words and knowledge. His voice grew quiet as he explained how his father's sudden death forced him to put aside that dream, how he took on every job he could find to keep food on the table for his mother and siblings. He smiled faintly as he added that he had no regrets, because family came first. Across the restaurant, the pranksters shifted in their seats. Their laughter had dulled into silence. They had expected stammering, awkward jokes, and humiliation. Instead, they were witnessing a man who carried his burdens with grace. Every word John spoke revealed not weakness but strength, not clumsiness but quiet resolve. What began as a cruel game was unraveling before their eyes, and none of them could look each other in the face. Victoria felt something stir inside her as she listened. She was used to conversations filled with numbers, strategies, and performances. Rarely did anyone sit across from her and speak with such honesty, with no agenda other than telling the truth. She realized she was seeing John not as the janitor who moved silently through her hallways, but as a man who embodied principles she admired but rarely encountered: sacrifice, humility, and unwavering dignity. The plates between them grew cold as time slipped by unnoticed. Their conversation deepened, no longer held back by nervousness or formality. For the first time that evening, John looked up and met her gaze without flinching. He admitted quietly that he often felt invisible, like a shadow moving through a world too busy to notice him. But then he added, almost as if reminding himself, that he never allowed that to strip away his dignity. It was the one thing he carried that no one could touch. Victoria sat back, his words lingering in the air between them. She felt them settle not only in her mind, but in her guarded heart. For years she had surrounded herself with walls built from control and power, but this simple admission cracked something inside her. She saw not just the janitor, but a man whose strength came not from wealth or position, but from refusing to let the world take away his humanity. John shifted uncomfortably as the waiter approached, holding a leather menu that seemed heavier than it should. He glanced at the polished pages, his eyes catching numbers that made his stomach tighten. He closed it quickly and lowered his voice. He said he would just have a coffee. His cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he tried to explain that he wasn't very hungry, but Victoria caught the hesitation in his tone. She smiled softly and told him not to worry. Dinner was on her. All she wanted was to hear his story. The kindness in her words disarmed him. For a long moment he stared at the tablecloth, the quiet hum of the restaurant pressing in around him. Then, slowly, as if choosing each memory carefully, he began to share what he rarely told anyone. He spoke of his wife, the love of his life, how illness had taken her too soon and left him alone with Emily, still small enough to need help tying her shoes. He described the endless nights when he worked 2 jobs, coming home exhausted, but still finding the strength to read bedtime stories or pack lunches before dawn. His words were simple, without embellishment, but every sentence carried the weight of sacrifice. He did not speak to impress. He spoke because, for once, someone seemed to truly want to listen. Victoria's eyes softened. She had heard countless stories from executives trying to sell themselves. Always polished, always calculated. John's story was different. It was raw, unguarded, filled with the kind of strength that came not from power, but from endurance. She felt something stir inside her that had been quiet for years. Genuine compassion. Admiration that had nothing to do with titles or success. Around them, the atmosphere began to change. A waiter, carrying a tray, slowed his steps, his eyes lingering on John as if drawn into the conversation. Diners at the nearest tables leaned slightly closer, their meals forgotten for a moment as they listened without meaning to. Even the pranksters who had orchestrated this evening sat still, their earlier laughter replaced with uneasy silence. They were witnessing something they had never expected. The joke was no longer funny. The man they meant to humiliate was revealing a depth that made their cruelty look small and pathetic. John kept his voice steady as he continued, though his eyes glistened with unspoken pain. He explained how every decision he made, every hour of overtime, every sacrifice was for Emily. He admitted that sometimes he felt invisible, like the world had passed him by. But then he added that if his daughter grew up knowing she was loved, that was enough. His humility, his quiet courage, filled the space between them with a power stronger than wealth or status. Victoria felt her chest tighten. The walls she had built over the years, the ones that kept her untouchable, began to crack. She realized she was not just listening out of courtesy. She was changed by his words, moved in a way she hadn't been in a long time. By the end of the story, she saw him not as the janitor she had overlooked countless times in the office, but as a man whose dignity shone brighter than any corner office or deal she had ever closed. The restaurant had grown quieter as John's voice carried through his story, but when he finished, the silence felt heavy, almost sacred. Victoria sat back, her hands folded on the table, her eyes locked on his face. She had been in countless rooms of power, had delivered speeches to investors and world leaders, but what she felt now was unlike anything she had known. The weight of his honesty demanded a response. Slowly, she rose to her feet. The clinking of cutlery paused. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray balanced in his hands. Conversations faded as people turned toward her, drawn by the presence of a woman everyone recognized, though few had ever seen so vulnerable. She lifted her glass, her voice steady but filled with conviction. She spoke loudly enough for every table to hear, including the group of pranksters who now looked uneasy in their seats. She said that she had expected an ordinary dinner, but had instead found something extraordinary. She told them that the man sitting before her had carried burdens heavier than most people could imagine, and he had done so without complaint, without applause, with nothing but quiet resilience. She declared that his sacrifices, his humanity, and his dignity were worth more than the wealth, titles, and million-dollar deals that so often defined success in their world. Respect, she said, was not about position or power. It was about the courage to keep going when life tried to break you. The room went still. A woman at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. The waiter lowered his tray slowly, his expression softening. The pranksters, once so sure of their cleverness, shifted uncomfortably. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by shame that reddened their faces. They had wanted to laugh at John, but now they found themselves exposed, their cruelty reflected back at them by the dignity of the man they tried to diminish. One of them pushed his chair back with a scrape against the floor, his eyes downcast as he hurried toward the exit. The others followed quietly, slipping out into the night, carrying the weight of humiliation they had meant for someone else. John sat frozen, his hands resting on the table, his eyes wide. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. For years he had been invisible, moving silently through hallways, never noticed, never acknowledged. Now the most powerful woman in the company was standing for him, her words lifting him out of the shadows and placing him in the center of the room. His throat tightened, his vision blurred as tears welled up. He blinked hard, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding himself steady. Around the restaurant, people remained hushed, as if afraid to break the spell of the moment. Some diners exchanged glances, nodding silently in agreement. Others simply stared at John, their faces reflecting awe and respect. They knew they were witnessing something larger than a dinner. It was not about food or status. It was about the reminder that humanity mattered more than anything else. Victoria's voice softened as she lowered her glass, but her words carried just as strongly. She said that men like John were the ones who kept the world standing, though most people never noticed. She thanked him for reminding her, and everyone else, of what true worth looked like. Then she sat down, her eyes meeting his, steady and unflinching. John swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process the flood of emotions crashing through him. Gratitude, disbelief, relief, and something deeper that he had not felt in years. Recognition. For the first time in so long, he was not invisible. He was seen. Not as a janitor, not as a man who had failed to reach the dreams of his youth, but as someone who had endured, who had carried love and responsibility on his shoulders, who had never surrendered his dignity. The room began to move again, waiters stepping carefully, diners resuming their meals, though their eyes still lingered on him with newfound respect. John exhaled slowly, his chest heavy but light at the same time. He realized something he had always known deep down but had needed to hear spoken aloud. Dignity cannot be taken away. It shines brightest when the world tries hardest to extinguish it. Tonight, in a place meant to humiliate him, that truth had never been clearer. The last echoes of Victoria's words still lingered in the restaurant when she set her glass down and looked at John. The room had begun to move again, waiters carrying trays, diners whispering to each other, but the air still felt different, as though everyone knew they had been part of something that would be remembered. Victoria reached across the table and offered her hand. John hesitated for a moment, then took it. Her grip was firm, steady, not the perfunctory handshake of a CEO, but something genuine. She told him that he had given her more perspective in one evening than most people managed in years. The simplicity of her words hit harder than anything else that night. For so long, John had carried the weight of being unseen, of existing only on the margins. Now he felt as though a light had been turned toward him, not to expose him, but to honor him. His throat tightened, and he managed only a quiet, "Thank you." But the look in his eyes said the rest. News of what had happened spread quickly, as things always do in a company where whispers travel faster than emails. By the next morning, stories were already circulating. Employees spoke about how the CEO had stood in the middle of a restaurant and defended the janitor, how her words had silenced a room and humbled everyone present. Some told it with awe, some with shame, and all of them with the sense that they had witnessed a turning point. Even outside the company, in the city itself, the story began to ripple. People repeated it as a reminder that respect is not measured by title, but by humanity. For John, the attention was strange, even overwhelming, but he knew it was not the headlines or the whispers that mattered. The real treasure was something far more personal. Emily heard about it too. She looked at her father differently that evening, her eyes full of pride he had never seen before. She had always loved him, but now she understood that others finally saw what she had known all along. Her dad was someone to look up to, not just in the small world of their apartment, but in the larger world that had so often overlooked him. That night, after the long evening at the restaurant, John and Emily walked home together. The city was alive with lights, and the cool air wrapped around them as they moved down the familiar streets. Emily held his hand tightly, swinging her arm back and forth as she chattered about the evening, about how proud she was. John listened, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Each step felt different, as though the burden he carried every day had been eased, not by the recognition itself, but by the fact that his daughter had seen him honored. Back at the restaurant, Victoria lingered for a moment by the window, watching them walk away. A faint smile touched her lips, not the professional smile she wore in meetings, but something quieter, almost tender. She realized that the evening had changed her too. She had entered expecting nothing more than a routine dinner, perhaps even an awkward one. But she left with a reminder that true strength is found in places the world often refuses to look. She had defended him, but in many ways, He had given her something greater. John squeezed Emily's hand as they turned the corner toward their building. The lights of the city stretched above them, but he no longer felt small beneath them. He knew the world would forget soon enough, that tomorrow he would still push his cart down the hallways and mop the floors. But that was all right. Because dignity was not something that could be given or taken. It was something that lived within, shining brightest when the world tried hardest to dim it. And tonight, walking home with his daughter's proud smile lighting the way, that truth had never felt clearer.